Nancy McCallum sits in her modest Bellevue home, surrounded by photographs that tell the story of a life that was cut tragically short. On the mantelpiece, a young Layne Staley grins from behind a birthday cake, his blue eyes bright with possibility. Nearby, another photo shows him at age 16, guitar in hand, already showing the intensity that would make him one of rock's most powerful voices. It's been over 20 years since her son died alone in his Seattle apartment. But for Nancy, the pain feels as fresh as if it happened yesterday. For the first time since Layne's death in 2002, she's ready to speak publicly about the warning signs she missed, the conversations she wishes she'd had, and the mother's guilt that has haunted her for 2 decades. People ask me how I didn't see it coming, she says, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly as she reaches for her coffee cup. But the truth is, I did see it. I saw all of it. I just didn't know what I was looking at until it was too late. Nancy's story begins not with Layne's final years, but with his childhood in Kirkland, Washington. Even as a young boy, Layne was different, sensitive, artistic, deeply empathetic, qualities that would later make his music so powerful, but also made him vulnerable to the world's darker influences. Layne felt everything more deeply than other kids, Nancy remembers. If he saw a hurt animal, he would cry for hours. If he watched a sad movie, he'd be affected for days. I thought it was beautiful that he had such a big heart. I never thought it would be the thing that destroyed him. The first real warning sign came when Layne was 14. Nancy found him in his room one afternoon, sitting on his bed with tears streaming down his face. When she asked what was wrong, he looked up at her with those piercing blue eyes and said something that still haunts her today. "Mom, do you ever feel like you're drowning, even when you're not in water?" Nancy thought it was typical teenage drama. She gave him a hug, told him everything would be okay, and suggested he go outside and play. She wishes now that she had sat down and really listened to what he was trying to tell her. He was describing depression, she says now. He was 14 years old and already dealing with clinical depression, and I had no idea. I thought he was just being dramatic. I thought it was a phase. The signs continued through high school. Layne's grades fluctuated wildly, brilliant one semester, failing the next. He had intense friendships that would end suddenly and dramatically. He wrote dark poetry in the margins of his notebooks, poetry that his teachers dismissed as typical adolescent angst. Looking back, every single thing pointed to a kid who was struggling with mental health issues, Nancy reflects. But in the 1980s, we didn't talk about depression or anxiety in teenagers. We just told them to toughen up and get over it. The music became Layne's escape. He taught himself to play guitar, spending hours in his room perfecting his technique. Nancy was thrilled that he had found a passion, something that seemed to bring him joy. She didn't realize that for Layne, music wasn't just a hobby. It was the only thing keeping him alive. Music was his therapy, she explains. When he played guitar or sang, the darkness couldn't touch him. But when the music stopped, it all came rushing back. I thought his intensity about music was artistic passion. I didn't know it was survival. When Layne told Nancy he was moving to Seattle to pursue music seriously, she was worried but supportive. It was 1987, and the grunge scene was just beginning to coalesce in the clubs and basements of Seattle. For a kid from the suburbs who felt different and misunderstood, the scene represented acceptance and artistic freedom. I drove him to his first apartment in Seattle, Nancy remembers. It was this tiny, dirty place in the University District. I wanted to cry looking at it. But Layne's face was glowing. He was so excited to be part of something bigger than himself. The early years seemed promising. Layne formed Alice in Chains with Jerry Cantrell, and Nancy could see her son coming alive in ways she'd never witnessed before. He was writing music, performing, building something meaningful with his art. Those first few years, he would call me after every show, so excited he could barely contain himself, she recalls. He'd tell me about the crowds, about new songs they were working on, about how Jerry was becoming like a brother to him. I thought we'd turned a corner. I thought he'd found his place in the world. But even during these good times, there were warning signs Nancy didn't recognize. Layne's phone calls became more erratic. Sometimes he'd call at 3 a.m., rambling about music and ideas, his speech rapid and unfocused. Other times, weeks would pass without any contact at all. But even during these good times, there were warning signs Nancy didn't recognize. Layne's phone calls became more erratic. Sometimes he'd call at 3 a.m., rambling about music and ideas, his speech rapid and unfocused. Other times, weeks would pass without any contact at all. I thought it was just the musician lifestyle, Nancy admits. Late nights, irregular schedules, the creative process. I didn't know that the erratic behavior was a sign that he was self-medicating his depression and anxiety with drugs. The first time Nancy truly suspected drug use was during a family gathering in 1990. Layne showed up late, thin and pale, with dark circles under his eyes. When she asked if he was feeling okay, he snapped at her, something that was completely out of character for her usually gentle son. He went to the bathroom and was in there for 20 minutes, she remembers. When he came out, he seemed more relaxed, more like himself. I told myself he was just tired, just stressed from the music business. But looking back, that was probably the first time I saw him high. Alice in Chains' breakthrough came with their 1990 debut album, Facelift. The success was everything Layne had dreamed of, but Nancy noticed it didn't seem to make him happy. If anything, fate appeared to amplify whatever demons he was fighting. Success was supposed to fix everything. Nancy reflects, we thought if Layne could just make it in music, all his problems would go away. But success doesn't cure depression. It doesn't heal childhood trauma. Sometimes it just gives you more resources to self-destruct. The warning signs became harder to ignore. Layne's weight began fluctuating dramatically. He would gain 20 pounds, then lose 30. His mood swings became more extreme. During family visits, he would be euphoric and talkative one moment, then sullen and withdrawn the next. He would hug me so tight it almost hurt, Nancy remembers of this period. He was trying to absorb love through his skin. He'd tell me he loved me over and over. He was afraid he wouldn't get another chance to say it to her. The most heartbreaking warning sign was Layne's relationship with children. He had always been wonderful with kids, but during the early 90s, Nancy noticed he avoided them entirely. My sister brought her toddler to a family dinner, and Layne wouldn't even look at him, Nancy recalls. When I asked why, he said, kids deserve better than someone like me around them. That should have been a red flag. When someone thinks they're too damaged to be around children, they're telling you they're in serious trouble. Nancy tried to address her concerns directly. She asked Layne about drugs during a phone call in 1992, and he deflected with humor. Mom, I'm a rock star, he told her. Of course I do drugs. It's in the contract. She laughed at the time, thinking he was joking. Years later, she realized he had been telling her the truth while making it sound like a punchline. Cobain's suicide in April of that year affected him profoundly, sending him into a spiral that Nancy could no longer ignore. After Kurt died, Layne called me crying. Nancy remembers. He said, Mom, what if Kurt was right? What if this is all there is? I should have driven to Seattle immediately. I should have forced him into treatment right then. Instead, Nancy tried to help from a distance. She sent care packages, made frequent phone calls, and arranged for other family members to check on him. But Layne was skilled at managing these interactions, putting on a performance of normalcy whenever family was around. He was protecting us from the truth, Nancy realizes now. Every time we visited, he would clean himself up just enough to seem okay. He'd gain a little weight, shower, put on clean clothes. We'd leave thinking he was getting better, not realizing we'd just seen him at his absolute best moment in weeks. The family discussed staging an intervention several times throughout the mid-1990s, but they were always talked out of it by well-meaning friends who insisted Layne needed to hit bottom on his own terms. That's the cruelest myth about addiction, Nancy says, her voice growing heated, that people need to hit rock bottom before they'll get help. Layne's rock bottom was death. We should have intervened when he was still climbing down, not waited for him to hit the floor. After 1996, Layne essentially disappeared from public life. Alice in Chains went on indefinite hiatus, and Layne retreated to his university district apartment. Nancy's contact with her son became increasingly sporadic and disturbing. The phone calls changed, she explains. Instead of talking about music or life, he would call to tell me he loved me. He was saying goodbye. I'd ask him what he meant, and he'd just say, "You never know, Mom, you never know." During this period, Nancy made several attempts to visit Layne unannounced, hoping to get a true picture of his condition. Each attempt ended in failure. I drove to his apartment in 1998 and buzzed his intercom for an hour. She remembers. I could hear music playing inside, so I knew he was there. I stood outside begging him to let me in. telling him I just wanted to see him, that I wasn't there to judge or lecture. But he never answered. The most painful warning sign came during their last meaningful conversation in 1999. Layne called Nancy at 2 a.m. His voice barely recognizable. "Mom," he whispered, "what happens to people like me? Do we ever get better?" Nancy tried to reassure him, telling him that recovery was possible, that she would help him find treatment, that the family would support him through anything. But Layne's response haunts her to this day. "I think I'm too far gone, Mom. I think I missed my chance." From 2000 to 2002, Nancy's contact with Layne dwindled to almost nothing. Concerned friends would call her with updates, always bad news about his declining physical condition, his increasing paranoia, his complete isolation from the world. Jerry Cantrell called me in 2001, Nancy recalls. He was crying. He said he'd tried to see Layne, but Layne wouldn't open the door even for him. Jerry said, "Nancy, I think we're losing him." And I knew. Deep down, I knew my son was dying, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The final warning sign came in March 2002, just weeks before Layne's death. Nancy received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, Layne as a child, maybe 8 years old, laughing at a family picnic. On the back, in Layne's handwriting, were 3 words, "Remember me this way." "I knew," Nancy says, tears streaming down her face. "I knew that was goodbye. But I still didn't call the police. I still didn't break down his door. I still thought maybe I was overreacting." 3 weeks later, Nancy received the phone call every parent dreads. Layne had been found dead in his apartment, his body so decomposed that the coroner estimated he had been dead for 2 weeks. The date of death, April the 5th, 2002, exactly 8 years after Kurt Cobain's suicide. In the 21 years since Layne's death, Nancy has carried a burden of guilt that threatens to crush her. Every warning sign she missed, every intervention she didn't stage, every phone call she didn't make, it all replays in her mind like a broken record. For the first 5 years after he died, I couldn't sleep, she admits. I would lie awake at night, going through every conversation we'd had, every sign I'd ignored, every opportunity I'd wasted to save him. The guilt almost killed me. Nancy sought therapy to deal with her grief and guilt. Through years of counseling, she's learned to reframe her understanding of addiction and her role in Layne's story. "Addiction is a disease," she says now. "I wouldn't blame myself if Layne had died of cancer, and I'm learning not to blame myself for his addiction. But that doesn't mean I don't wish I'd done things differently." Nancy has also educated herself extensively about addiction and mental health, becoming an advocate for early intervention and family support services. "I know now that Layne's depression started in childhood," she explains. "The addiction came later, but it was his way of treating the depression that no one was helping him with. If we'd gotten him mental health treatment at 14, instead of telling him to toughen up, maybe everything would have been different." Looking back with the wisdom of experience and education, Nancy can now see the clear pattern of warning signs that led to Layne's death. She shares this knowledge, hoping other families might recognize these signs in their own loved ones. "The isolation was the biggest red flag," she says. "When someone stops seeing friends and family, when they start avoiding social situations they used to enjoy, that's a sign they're in serious trouble." Other warning signs Nancy wishes she had recognized: extreme mood swings, unrelated to external circumstances, changes in personal hygiene and appearance, weight fluctuations that couldn't be explained, erratic sleep patterns and time confusion, increased secrecy about daily activities, expressing feelings of worthlessness or hopelessness, saying goodbye in subtle ways like excessive expressions of love, using humor to deflect serious conversations. The hardest thing to accept is that Layne was telling us he was struggling. Nancy reflects. "When he asked me if I ever felt like I was drowning, he was asking for help. When he called to tell me he loved me like it was goodbye, he was asking for help." Nancy has channeled her grief into advocacy work, speaking to families dealing with addiction and working with treatment centers to improve intervention services. "I get calls from parents worried about their children," she says. "They describe behavior that sounds exactly like what I ignored in Layne. Now, I tell them, trust your instincts. If you think your child is in trouble, they probably are, Nancy works with Seattle-based addiction treatment centers, serving on family services boards and helping develop programs that teach families how to recognize warning signs. We have to stop waiting for people to ask for help, Nancy insists. Addiction hijacks the brain's ability to make good decisions. By the time someone is ready to ask for help, they might be too sick to actually get better. Despite the tragedy, Nancy tries to focus on the love they shared and the positive impact Layne's music continues to have worldwide. I get letters from fans telling me how Layne's music helped them through difficult times, she says. Some say his songs about addiction helped them get clean. Others say his openness about depression made them feel less alone. Nancy has found peace, connecting with Jerry Cantrell and Alice in Chains members, who've helped her understand that Layne's final years weren't just about addiction. Jerry told me that even at his worst, Layne would talk about me, Nancy shares. He'd tell the band stories about his childhood, about how much he loved me, knowing I was still important to him, even when he was sick. That helps. Nancy's message is clear. Don't wait. Don't assume it's a phase. Don't let pride or fear prevent you from seeking help. If you think your child is using drugs, they probably are, she says bluntly. If you think they're depressed, they probably are. Trust that worry. You know your child better than anyone. She encourages parents to educate themselves about addiction and mental health, remove stigma from family conversations, and seek professional help at the first sign of trouble. I wish I'd dragged Layne to therapy when he was 14, Nancy reflects. I wish I'd known that creative, sensitive kids are at higher risk for mental health issues. 21 years after Layne's death, Nancy's grief has evolved, but never disappeared. She's learned to carry it differently, to find meaning in tragedy, to help other families avoid devastating loss. I'll always wonder what if she says. What if I'd forced him into treatment earlier? What if I'd trusted my maternal instincts? But Nancy has found peace, remembering Layne as more than his addiction. She thinks about the boy who cried for hurt animals, the teenager who found solace in music, the young man whose voice touched millions. Layne was kind, she says simply. Even when he was sick, his fundamental kindness never went away. That's what I want people to remember. Nancy keeps photographs showing Layne happy and creative. The last photo she added shows him on stage in 1992, radiant with joy while performing. That's my son, Nancy says. Not the addiction, but that beautiful, talented young man who just wanted to make music and be loved. If my pain can prevent another family from going through this, she says, then maybe Layne's story can save someone else's child. That's how I honor my beautiful boy's memory.